I wasn't invited to my own son's engagement party. She's embarrassing, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. I carried him for 9 months, signed the mortgage that saved him. But in the end, I just circled the date, sold the house, and kept quiet. The auctioneer's voice rose over the lawn. He thought he owned. And when the keys changed hands, I didn't send a warning. Just let the new owners knock. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Maggie Lowell froze mid-step, the kettle hissing behind her. She hadn't meant to eavesdrop, not deliberately, but Evan's voice carried too clearly through the slightly ajar French doors that led out to her porch. He was pacing outside, phone pressed to his ear, back turned to the window, oblivious to the fact that she was just inside. She'll wear some outdated cardigan or say something weird about Dad again. It's not the vibe we want, okay? He said, the frustration sharp in his tone. Sophie wants elegant, minimal, no drama. The kettle whistled louder. Maggie didn't move. For a long moment after he walked off the porch, still on the call, she stood rooted beside her kitchen island, the steam curling around her face like smoke from a slow-burning insult. She finally turned off the flame and poured the water over her chamomile, watching the flowers swirl, then settle. A dull ache bloomed just behind her eyes. The phone call played on loop in her mind, too embarrassing. Not the vibe. No drama. Like she was a toddler prone to tantrums. Not a woman who had raised him alone after his father died of a stroke, the summer Evan turned 12. Not someone who had co-signed his mortgage 5 years ago, when he was flailing after a bitter divorce. No, none of that mattered now. All that mattered to Evan was Sophie's curated aesthetic, and a party where nothing, and no one disrupted the Instagram symmetry. The tea cooled untouched. She didn't. A soft knock tapped against the back door, then again louder. Maggie blinked, setting the cup down with a faint clink. She opened the door to find Nora Bennett standing there with her usual oversized sunglasses and a fresh paper bag from her morning bakery run. You look like someone just ran over your petunias, Nora said, stepping in. What's going on? Maggie didn't answer right away. She walked back to the kitchen table and sat down, hands clasped loosely in her lap. She stared at the woven placemat. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, even. Evan said I'm too embarrassing to be invited to his engagement party. The air seemed to change. Even the birds outside went oddly quiet. Nora set the bakery bag down with a sharp thud. He said what? Sophie doesn't want me there. He said I'm not part of the vibe. Oh, screw the vibe, Nora snapped, pulling out a chair across from her. This is the same kid who once peed his pants in the checkout line at Fred Meyer. You held his hand through 2 recessions, 3 job changes, and that train wreck of a first marriage. And now you're off-brand? Maggie gave a faint, tired smile. I suppose I am. You're not actually going to let this slide, are you? Nora's eyes narrowed. Because that would be off-brand for you. Maggie didn't answer. Her fingers moved to the ceramic edge of her teacup, tracing the rim in slow circles. The tension in her shoulders had hardened into something colder, heavier. Not quite anger, not yet, but something close. She started, then stopped. A gust of wind rustled the curtains beside them. She looked up, and something in her expression shifted. The sadness was still there, but it had been joined by something else. Calculation. I don't want to fight with him, she said quietly. But I'm also done being treated like furniture in his perfect little lifestyle spread. Nora's eyes lit with the sharp glint of recognition. She'd seen this look before. Back when Maggie fought tooth and nail to stop a land developer from gutting their block. Or when she challenged the HOA over street parking and won. You've got something brewing, Nora said slowly. I can feel it. What is it? Maggie stood, crossed the room and opened the drawer of her old roll-top desk. She rummaged through folders until she found a dusty blue binder. Legal documents, property records, old mortgage agreements. She looked over her shoulder, voice quiet but edged with steel. I co-own that house he lives in. Remember? Nora leaned against the kitchen counter, arms folded. You still own half that house of his, right? Maggie closed the binder gently, her gaze never leaving the window where Evan had stood earlier. He just doesn't know what that means. The sharp scent of dust and old paper filled the spare bedroom, as Maggie yanked open the lowest drawer of her oak filing cabinet. Her knees cracked as she crouched down, but she didn't notice. Her fingers moved fast, flipping through manila folders labeled with faded Sharpie, taxes, health insurance, kitchen remodel 2014. She paused at the tab marked property. Evan, her breath catching like a match striking air. The folder was heavier than she remembered. She set it down on the worn carpet, cross-legged now, surrounded by curling documents, and a quiet so thick she could hear her own heartbeat. At the top of the stack was the deed. Her name was still on it. Margaret L. Lowell and Evan R. Lowell, listed as joint owners. Her hand hovered over the page. She hadn't looked at this document in years, not since she'd helped him secure the place. A two-bedroom craftsman on a quiet street, back when he was reeling from his divorce, and Sophie was just an aspirational Instagram follow. The bank had been hesitant. His credit wasn't bad, but not solid either. Maggie had stepped in. Just a signature. Just a little backup. He promised he'd refinance in 6 months. That was 5 years ago. Maggie ran her fingertips along the typed lines, her pulse slowing. A sudden clarity settled over her like a weighted blanket. He hadn't refinanced. Not once. Not even when rates dropped. Because he assumed she wouldn't care. Her phone buzzed beside her on the nightstand. Nora had sent a meme. Something about adult children needing a good spanking and fewer opinions. Maggie smiled, but it faded quickly. She picked up the phone again and typed Frank Delaney, real estate attorney. His office still used a landline. She liked that. It rang twice. Frank Delaney came the familiar gravelly voice. Frank, it's Maggie Lowell. A pause. Maggie, I was just thinking about you last week. Someone was asking if you still had that oak desk in your old office. She gave a soft laugh. That desk is in my garage collecting spiderweb, but I've got a legal question. Personal this time. Hit me. If a mother co-signed on her son's mortgage, and her name is still on the deed, could she force a sale? Silence hummed on the other end. Then legally, yes. If it's joint ownership, and you're both listed as tenants in common, you can file a petition for partition. Court can order the property to be sold, and proceed split. And if she paid the down payment, Maggie added, gently. Even stronger case. Why? What's going on, Maggie? She stood, moving toward the window. Outside, the sunlight filtered through the backyard maple tree, casting golden patterns across her lawn. She imagined Evan's house 2 blocks over. Neat lawn. Freshly painted porch. All outward polish. Let's just say I wasn't invited to something, she said. And I think I've been too generous for too long. Frank was quiet again. Are you sure you want to go down this road? She turned from the window, eyes sharper now. I'm tired of being a side character in my own family. Well, Frank said, clearing his throat, there's some paperwork I'd need to get started. Filing fees. Timeline depends on the court's calendar. But yes, you have every right to force a sale. Maggie sat on the edge of the bed, still holding the deed in her hand. Her wedding ring, now worn on a chain around her neck, glinted faintly against the paper. I'll cover the fees, she said. And I'd like this done properly. I'll make sure of it, Frank said. She leaned back against the pillows, letting her eyes close for just a second, a small smile curling at the edges of her mouth. Not triumph, not yet, just the satisfaction of knowing something important. He wasn't untouchable, not behind a guest list, not behind an image. Then Frank's voice came again, lower this time, as if sensing what she was already thinking. Maggie, do you want me to start the process? The click of the pen was deliberate. Maggie capped it slowly, then slid the signed retainer agreement across Frank's glossy mahogany desk, like she was placing a bet on a high-stakes game, and she was. Only Evan didn't know he was sitting across the table. Frank skimmed the signature, his readers perched low on his nose. That's that then, he murmured, tapping the paper twice. You ready for this? Maggie folded her hands in her lap, spine straight as an arrow. Was I ready to bury my husband? Was I ready to co-sign on a house I never stepped foot in after he moved in with Sophie? She paused. Doesn't matter. Readiness is a luxury. Frank gave a slow nod, scribbling notes on his legal pad. His office tucked inside an aging red brick building near Pioneer Courthouse Square, smelled faintly of leather, paper and the bite of old coffee. Outside the window, the city buzzed, streetcars trundling past, voices echoing from a protest gathering down the block, seagulls crying above. The petition for partition's straightforward, he said, sliding a new document toward her. Once we file, the court sets a hearing date. We make our case for an auction. Market's hot, judge won't blink. And Sophie? Maggie asked, her tone neutral. She's got no standing. She's not on the deed, not on the loan. Evan's the one who'll have to respond. But I bet he'll drag his feet, thinking you'll blink first. I won't. Frank studied her for a moment, then leaned back. You'll cover court costs, service fees, and appraisals up front. Once the house sells, it comes out of your share. Is that acceptable? Maggie reached for her purse and pulled out her checkbook, the one with the hummingbirds across the cover. Bill me now. No delays. As she signed, her phone buzzed. A text from Nora, outside with the car running. Still think you should wear your lipstick. Courthouse deserves drama. Maggie smirked and stood smoothing her slate gray cardigan. Nora's waiting downstairs. She insisted on driving me. Said no woman should walk into court paperwork sober or alone. She's right, Frank said, walking her to the door. This isn't just a filing. It's a declaration. They exited the office together, heels tapping against the tiled hallway. The elevator creaked down like it, too, was carrying the weight of Maggie's resolve. 15 minutes later, Maggie stood at the Multnomah County Courthouse filing window. The clerk had coral lipstick, a nose ring, and eyes that didn't flinch when Maggie handed over the packet. The young woman flipped through it with mechanical speed, then stamped the top page. Petition received, she said. You'll be notified of a court date within 10 business days. Anything else? No, Maggie said, voice even. That'll do. Outside, the sky was streaked with August gold, the scent of roasting food cart meats wafting from the corner plaza. Nora waited at the curb, idling in her old Subaru, sunglasses on and coffee in hand. She rolled down the window as Maggie approached. So? She asked. It's filed, Maggie said simply, sliding into the passenger seat. Nora let out a low whistle and offered her cup. Take a victory sip. Maggie took it and did. Back home, Maggie had just kicked off her shoes when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered cautiously. Hello? A chirpy voice met her ear. This is Tina Morales from the Rivermark Hotel. I'm handling Evan Lowell and Sophie Blake's engagement event next month. Sophie asked me to double-check RSVPs, since she hadn't heard from you yet. Maggie walked to the window, looking out across her backyard. The hydrangeas were blooming hard and wide, pink like defiance. She tapped the glass with one finger once. I won't be attending, she said, polite but firm. Oh, okay. Do you want me to note a reason for the couple? Maggie paused, a smile just touching her lips. I'll be busy that day. Evan opened the door barefoot, coffee in hand, expecting a package from his wedding registry. Instead, a man in khakis and a windbreaker handed him a thick envelope and said 3 words that dropped like bricks. You've been served. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the stained glass transom. Maggie didn't hear about it until 2 hours later. Not from Evan, but from Sophie. The call came while she was stirring compost into her garden bed, the morning sun still cool against the back of her neck. Her gloves were caked in dirt, hair pinned back with one of Nora's old silk scarves. Her phone rang on the porch rail. She pulled one glove off with her teeth and checked the screen. Sophie B. She let it go to voicemail. It rang again. Same name. 3rd time Maggie answered. What the hell is wrong with you? Sophie's voice was shrill, clipped, like it had been squeezed through a filter of rage and iced coffee. What kind of mother does this to her own child? Maggie didn't blink. Is Evan okay? No, he's not okay. Some creepy guy showed up with court papers. What is this? An auction notice. Are you insane? I'm within my rights, Maggie said calmly. Legally and emotionally. You blindsided him. You're ruining everything. Maggie stared out at her hydrangeas, blooming like they didn't care who hated who. You sent out engagement invites. I sent out a legal notice. Seems like we're all making announcements these days. Sophie went quiet. Just for a beat. You're bitter, that's what this is. No, Maggie replied. I'm awake. And then she hung up. The next 3 hours brought 3 voicemails from Evan. Maggie listened to none of them. She watched the timestamps pile up on her screen while she trimmed basil and planted fall lettuce. Nora arrived just before noon, holding a brown bag with sandwiches from their favorite cafe and 2 cold bottles of sparkling water. Heard the shriek from 3 blocks away, she said, nodding toward Maggie's phone. How bad? Dog whistle level, Maggie said. Sophie's upset. Evan's pretending to be shocked. You'd think he didn't know what paperwork was, Nora muttered, biting into her sandwich. Men like to skip fine print, especially when they think they're winning. They sat on the porch steps, the garden stretching out in front of them, birds chirping from the camellia bush like nothing in the world was broken. Maggie savored every bite, each crunch of lettuce and tang of Dijon grounding her. Around 2, Frank called. Got a court date, he said. Judge Holbrook. 2 weeks from Friday. That soon? Yep. He doesn't like disputes clogging up the docket. The notice was filed cleanly. Evans got a chance to respond, but frankly he's got no real leg to stand on. Unless he wants to buy you out. He doesn't have that kind of money, Maggie said. Then we'll see him in court. Maggie thanked him and hung up, letting the phone rest on the porch beside her. She felt the tension behind her ribs loosen a notch. Not victory, not yet, but a solid first step. As the sun dipped lower, she and Nora gathered tools and emptied the compost bucket, chatting about an upcoming documentary at the Art House Theater, and whether the city's new zoning laws would affect their block. The conversation drifted peaceful, as evening light painted their lawns honey gold. Maggie was just rinsing her hands in the utility sink when her phone buzzed again. A text. Tina Morales, Rivermark Hotel. I think you should know. They moved the party. Maggie stared at the screen, droplets of water sliding down her wrists. She wiped her hands, read the message again, and let a slow smile form. Not from triumph. From confirmation her silence had finally made noise. The Rivermark Hotel lobby was booked for candlelight, soft jazz, and the scent of overpriced roses. But it stood eerily silent, on what should have been Evan and Sophie's big day. No guests arrived, no champagne flowed, and no one posted the usual, she said yes, hashtag under a filtered skyline photo. Instead, Maggie's phone buzzed with a Google alert. Event cancelled. Lowell Blake engagement. Soiree postponed until further notice. She stared at the screen, then placed it face down on the kitchen table beside her teacup and a neat stack of legal correspondence. The smell of lemon polish lingered in the air. Nora had insisted on helping clean, saying a well-kept kitchen is the best place to hatch a war. The war, it seemed, had just claimed its first battle. Later that morning, Nora barged in with a travel mug and a wicked grin, holding up her phone like a trophy. Listen to this, she said, eyes already gleaming. She read aloud in her best faux concerned influencer voice. Some people love drama, even in their golden years. Sad when family turns toxic, but love always wins #blessed #detoxing. My circle, Sophie, Maggie asked. Already knowing. Front and center, Nora said, scrolling, also posted a quote card about boundaries. Looks like she downloaded it from one of those pop therapy accounts. Maggie sipped her tea without comment. She really thought she could erase you with a hashtag, Nora added. I've seen toddlers try harder to clean up messes. The kettle hissed in the background. Outside, birds chirped like nothing had changed, but Maggie could feel it. Something had shifted. The silence from Evan's side of the street was thick, almost apologetic, or maybe just stunned. The quiet didn't last long. Frank called just after noon, his tone brisk but pleased. Court dates locked in. Judge Holbrook confirmed. We'll present the petition. Evan can object, though I doubt he'll have anything useful to say. He'll try, Maggie said. Let him, Frank replied. We have the law, and leverage. She thanked him and hung up, her gaze drifting out the front window. The day was overcast but dry. She pulled on a light coat and walked 2 blocks to Evans Street, the soles of her shoes clicking sharply on the uneven sidewalk. Evans' house sat still, blinds drawn, trash bins half pulled to the curb. The hedge along the driveway had grown wild, prickly with neglect. A shutter on the side hung slightly crooked. The front porch railing needed paint. Maggie took it all in with the quiet detachment of a former broker. She had staged homes that sold within hours, and toured foreclosures that reeked of rot. Evan's house wasn't failing, not yet, but it was fraying at the edges, like its owner. When she saw the white pickup truck pull to the curb, she didn't move. A young man in jeans and a gray polo stepped out, balancing a large wooden sign with bright red lettering, for auction by court order. Lowell residence contact, Delaney and Asok. He placed it carefully on the lawn, just to the left of the mailbox. Maggie stood and watched. When the installer noticed her, she gave a small nod. He nodded back, then drove away. The sign stood alone on the manicured grass, like a verdict. That night, Maggie ate leftovers and played a vinyl record that Henry used to love. An old Miles Davis album, with a scratch in the second track. The trumpet stuttered faintly, and she let it play all the way through. Some imperfections didn't need fixing. Just after 9 p.m., her phone lit up again. A text from Frank. You might want to sit down. There's already a serious buyer lined up. Maggie stared at the screen, her heart giving one sharp knock against her ribs. Not a nibble, not interest. A serious buyer. Before the gavel had even dropped. The envelope was heavy, too heavy for regular mail. Maggie turned it over in her hands before slicing it open with the same brass letter opener she'd used when she and Henry bought their first home on 43rd Street. Inside was a cover sheet from Frank, and below it the offer, a legitimate, clean, 6-figure bid, well above appraisal, signed, documented, and already approved for financing. The buyer even wanted a 30-day close. Maggie let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The numbers stared up at her from the page like a challenge and a promise all at once. She reached for a pen, then paused, took a beat, and stood to make a cup of Earl Grey. As the kettle warmed, she spread the documents out across her kitchen table, smoothing the corners like fabric. The buyer was a developer, local, not one of those big conglomerates. Someone looking to rebuild on the lot. A fresh start for the property, and for her. Nora walked in through the back door, still in her denim jacket and scarf, clutching 2 glazed donuts in a white paper bag. You look like someone just read their fortune and it said, "Total upheaval coming, wear nice shoes." Maggie smiled faintly, and handed her the cover sheet. Nora squinted, scanning the lines. Wow, this is real, like fast-moving real. They want to close before the holidays. Are you okay with this? Nora asked, lowering her voice. Not just the legal part, the emotional blowback. Evan's going to have a full-blown fit. Maggie poured the tea, the scent of bergamot curling into the air like a whispered warning. I've slept better this week than I have in years, she said quietly. You know what that tells me? Nora shook her head. That this isn't revenge, Maggie said. It's relief. They ate the donuts in silence. Just the occasional creak of Nora's chair or the clink of spoon on porcelain. Outside, the wind tossed leaves against the windows like they were trying to get inside and argue with her too. It was early evening when the first knock came. Sharp, fast, familiar. Maggie glanced toward the door but didn't move. She could picture the posture already. Evan standing with one hand in his coat pocket, jaw clenched, tapping his foot like she was late for a meeting he hadn't scheduled. The second knock came louder, followed by a muffled shout. Mom, I know you're home. She stayed seated, turning a page in the novel she'd been meaning to finish for months. A courtroom drama, oddly fitting. You don't have to do this, he yelled again. We can fix it. She didn't believe him, and more importantly, he didn't either. After a few more seconds of silence, footsteps thudded down her porch steps. Then something slid beneath the front door. She pulled a pale envelope, like the one she'd opened that morning but handwritten. She waited until she heard the engine of his car fade into the distance. Then she stood and picked it up. The writing on the front was unmistakably his, that stubborn, straight-backed print she'd taught him in 3rd grade when the school said his handwriting was too messy to read. She opened the note with steady fingers. We need to talk, please, before it's too late. No signature, just those 8 words, scratched onto plain paper like they'd cost him something. She stood at the door for a long moment, the cool air slipping in beneath the frame and brushing her bare ankles. Then she folded the note, tucked it into the back of the offer packet, and returned to her seat. Some conversations could wait, others never needed to happen at all. But either way, the clock had started ticking, and this time she wasn't the one running out of time. Maggie had just stepped outside with her morning coffee when she heard his car door slam, hard, too hard, the kind of slam that didn't just shut, it accused. She turned slowly, ceramic mug warm in her hand, as Evan came up the driveway with a stiff, almost frantic gait. His eyes were bloodshot, his hair, usually slicked back, polished, looked slept on and forgotten. Why are you doing this? He snapped before he was even fully in view. You're destroying everything I've built. Maggie raised her eyebrows slightly, not startled, just unimpressed. Morning, Evan. Don't start with that, he said, voice loud in the quiet neighborhood. You think filing that petition was some kind of lesson? You've humiliated me. Sophie's family's asking questions. My friends think I'm hiding something. That sounds inconvenient, Maggie said calmly, stepping off the porch and onto the walkway. Actions tend to ripple, don't they? You blindsided me. What kind of mother? No, she cut in, voice firm but low. What kind of son takes help, then pretends it came with no strings? What kind of man builds a life and forgets who helped him lay the first brick? Evan faltered, his mouth hanging open. Then his tone softened, shifting gears. I didn't mean to leave you out. It wasn't like that. Sophie thought maybe you'd feel out of place. You know how you get at events. Maggie took a slow sip of her coffee and tilted her head. Say it straight. You take over conversations. You make things awkward. Honesty finally. Her lips curled, not in a smile but something sharper. You're right. I can be a little much. Especially when I'm ignored. Or used. His jaw flexed. Mom, Maggie, whatever this is, it's not you. You're not vindictive. No, she said, taking a step closer. I'm not vindictive. I'm just done waiting for you to treat me like I matter. Evan's face shifted again, now desperation, thin and cracking. He moved closer and opened his arms like he might hug her. Can we just please reset? Let's talk this through like normal people. But Maggie stepped back, slow and deliberate. You're mistaking proximity for reconciliation. I'm not here for show. I'm not part of your backdrop. From the corner of her eye, she saw movement at the fence. Nora leaning against it, arms crossed, still in her pajamas, cup of coffee in hand. Morning, Nora, Maggie called. Didn't want to miss the show. Nora replied, not bothering to hide her smirk. Need backup. I'm fine, Maggie said without taking her eyes off Evan. He was just leaving. Evan's eyes darted to Nora, then back to Maggie, his face turning a shade deeper. His throat bobbed once, then again. You don't have to do this. I already did. I could have handled this another way, he said through clenched teeth. You didn't have to take it public. Neither did you, she said, stepping onto the porch. But you made it public the moment you cut me out of your life like bad PR. He didn't respond, just stood there, fists clenched, lips pressed into a thin line. She watched him, not with cruelty, but with clarity. Then, without another word, Evan turned and walked back to his car, each step slower than the last. Maggie waited until the engine started and his tail lights faded down the block. She exhaled and finally sat on the porch swing, the mug now empty, but her chest light. Nora appeared at her side, holding a second cup of coffee. He looked like he rehearsed that in the mirror 6 times and still flubbed it. Maggie chuckled. Didn't work. Didn't even land, Nora said, clinking her mug gently against Maggie's. An hour later, Maggie's phone buzzed on the porch table. At Sophie Blake official had just posted, "Some people can't let go of the past, even if it means burning bridges to the ground. #family drama. #protect your peace. Still getting married." Maggie read the post twice, then tilted the phone toward Nora. Nora grinned. She's really hoping hashtags work in court. The first message came from Barbara Lansing, someone Maggie hadn't seen since the garden club dissolved during the pandemic. Saw Sophie's post. "So sorry things are strained between you and Evan. Hope you find peace." Maggie read it 3 times. Not what happened, not do you want to talk. Just a vaguely performative guilt grenade, the kind designed to imply the worst without saying it outright. She tapped delete. Then she deleted the next one, and the next. A string of texts and Facebook messages from people who had no business forming opinions, but suddenly seemed to have time for unsolicited pity, concern, or worse. Phone neutral, just checking in messages. All sparked by Sophie's carefully curated weapon, a photo of her holding a champagne flute, fake smiling at some rooftop event, with the caption, "When family becomes poison, cut the cord before it strangles your future. #detox season. #self-care. The hashtag did more damage than the words. By that evening, Maggie's inbox felt like a church bulletin board full of whispers. She didn't respond. Not once. Instead, she poured herself a glass of red, put on a Nina Simone record, and let the rumors move through Portland like wildfire through dry brush. Let them talk. Let them decide who was wrong. Let them project their fears and fragile etiquette onto her. Because the truth was coming, and it wouldn't need hashtags. The next morning, Nora walked in with 2 lattes and a smug expression. "I heard Janine from the neighborhood yoga studio asked if you'd had a breakdown." Maggie snorted. "Did you tell her I finally got some peace and clarity?" "No," Nora said. "I told her you were training to become a probate ninja, and taking down generational trauma with a machete." Maggie laughed, setting aside the list of documents Frank had asked her to review. "That's oddly accurate." She looked terrified. Nora added, settling into the breakfast nook chair. "The silence is driving them nuts. They're all waiting for you to post some long-winded defense." "I'm not giving them one," Maggie said. "Let Evan tell his version. Let Sophie style hers. I've got court papers and deeds. They can have captions and filters." As if summoned by the mention of the legal side, her email dinged. Frank Delaney, Remy auction date finalized. Maggie opened it, her breath pausing just for a second. The court had approved the final date, 2 Fridays from now. Public auction. Certified. No reversals. Her name legally would be on every notice. "Is that it?" Nora asked. Maggie turned the screen toward her. "It's official." Nora gave a low whistle, then raised her coffee cup like a toast. To the final nail in the Pinterest-perfect coffin. Maggie walked to the fridge, found her magnetized calendar, and circled the date in red. Then she stood there, hand still resting on the door handle, letting the moment settle around her. She wasn't nervous, not even angry anymore, just ready. The day moved quietly after that. Maggie tended the garden, made lentil soup, and finally dusted the sunroom. By nightfall, she was on the porch, cardigan draped around her shoulders, watching the city lights flicker across the hills. The stars were faint but visible, and the wind carried a crisp bite of the fall to come. Her phone buzzed on the armrest. Evan, a text this time. Short, sharp, final. "You'll regret this." She stared at the screen for a long while, the glow painting her face pale in the dark. Then, without flinching, she locked the phone and turned her eyes back to the skyline. Let him believe she'd feel regret. Let him toss warnings like threats in the dark. Because Maggie wasn't the one who should be afraid of what came next. and soon he'd realize that. The hard way. The auction hall buzzed like a beehive, just before smoke. Suits rustled, voices murmured. The air was thick with heat from too many bodies, and the stale scent of industrial carpet and coffee left too long on a burner. Maggie sat quietly in the back row, fingers laced over her purse, her breath steady, measured. She spotted Evan near the front, jaw tight, arms folded, a sheen of sweat already gathering at his temple. Sophie was nowhere in sight. Is it bad I'm hoping someone bids just to piss him off? Nora whispered beside her, fanning herself with the folded court docket. He should have worn lighter colors if he wanted sympathy. Maggie murmured back, not looking away from the auctioneer's podium. Frank stood just off to the right, clipboard in hand, giving her a quick nod across the room. Then he leaned in to speak to the auctioneer, who tapped the mic once. The murmur dimmed. Court-ordered auction for property number 1427. The auctioneer began, his voice crisp, carrying easily through the hall. Two-bedroom craftsman located in the Hawthorne district. Opening bid set at $395,000. The first paddle rose almost before the number was finished. 400. Someone called from the left. 410. Another shouted from the center aisle. Evan jerked slightly, twisting around to see who was bidding. His eyes scanned the crowd, wide and wild. 425, 430, 445. The numbers escalated in rapid succession, punctuated by the rhythmic slap of paddles and the auctioneer's rising tempo. Maggie didn't move. She kept her gaze forward, her breath even. Beside her, Nora whispered, "They're practically fighting over it." At 470, Evan turned around again, this time locking eyes with Maggie. His mouth parted like he might say something. Beg, accuse, maybe plead. She held his gaze, then tilted her head just enough to say, "You did this." He turned back around, sat perfectly. Didn't bid. 500,000. A woman in a blazer near the front yelled. "Do I hear 510? The auctioneer pressed. 510. Another paddle went up. 510. Evan looked like a statue with a pulse. His fists clenched so tightly the tips of his fingers had gone white. He looked smaller now, defeated, like someone watching the last parachute float down to earth without him. 520. Sold. The auctioneer finally shouted, slamming the gavel, to bidder 027 for $520,000. The crowd broke into applause, polite, transactional, satisfied. Maggie didn't clap. Frank was already making his way toward her. As he reached them, he pulled a crisp envelope from his inner jacket pocket. "Your certified check," he said, handing it to Maggie. "Clean deal. No contingencies. Cash buyer." Maggie took it slowly, letting the weight settle in her hands. Half the sale. Hers legally. A number she hadn't expected to see in one lifetime, handed to her not as a gift, but as reclamation. "Thank you," she said. Across the room, Evan stood up, loud, abrupt, and stormed out before the applause finished echoing. The door slammed behind him, hard enough to draw a few turned heads. Frank glanced after him, and sighed. "Can't say I'm surprised." Nora leaned over. "He didn't even wait for the final paperwork?" "He knew he wasn't getting a dime," Frank said. "Too many missed payments." His equity was thinner than he realized. Maggie tucked the envelope into her purse, and stood. Her knees popped slightly, but she didn't feel it. Outside, the Portland air was sharp and cool. Leaves danced down the sidewalk, yellow and crisp. As they stepped onto the curb, Frank cleared his throat. "Might want to brace yourself for one more surprise." Maggie turned. "What now?" "The buyer's a developer," he said. "Already filed plans for demolition. Full teardown and rebuild." Nora let out a low whistle. Evan wanted to build a legacy. Frank added, "They're going to raise it to the studs." Maggie stared at him, quiet for a beat. Then she smiled, soft, unbothered, as the wind tugged gently at her scarf. "Well," she said, "I suppose that's one way to clear the past." The courtroom was colder than necessary, air conditioning set to discomfort, as if discomfort alone might separate the reasonable from the desperate. Evan stood in front of the judge, like a man begging for his reputation, not his rights. He wore a navy blazer that didn't quite fit anymore, and a look of studied outrage that cracked every time he stumbled over a legal term. "This was my home," he said, voice breaking just slightly. "I didn't authorize the sale. I didn't agree to the demolition. This is retaliation." Judge Holbrook peered at him over the rims of her glasses, unimpressed. "Mr. Lowell, the partition and sale were processed lawfully through the appropriate channels. You were notified, served, and given time to respond. You did not pursue a buyout. You attended the auction and chose not to bid. There is no legal standing for your objection. But she, my mother, she," he began. The judge cut him off with a raise of her hand. "Emotion is not evidence, Mr. Lowell." Maggie sat behind Frank in the gallery, silent, spine straight, lips neutral. She didn't flinch. She didn't smile. She simply listened as her son unraveled, like a man trying to wrestle smoke. 10 minutes later, the gavel hit the block. "Motion to contest is dismissed." Outside the courthouse, Evan didn't look at her, didn't speak. He walked past, jaw tight, shoulders high like armor, and disappeared into the parking garage. Frank handed her a folder. "Final paperwork. You're officially out." Maggie nodded once. The wind caught her scarf, and she pulled it tighter. "Not out," she said. "Just clear." The dumpsters came first. 2 massive metal containers, parked right on the curb, bright orange with black spray paint that read Demo Crew, Hawthorne Zone. Maggie saw them as she drove home from the bank, stopped at the light just half a block from Evan's old house. His house. Not anymore. The roof still stood. The windows still held their shape. But the presence of those dumpsters shifted the entire street's energy. The house was marked. A shell waiting to be stripped. She rolled her window down and caught the scent of sawdust, already in the air, carried on the late morning breeze. A foreman stood out front, clipboard in hand, yelling instructions to 2 young workers, who began unbolting the porch rail. Evan had once painted gray. "Wanna have lunch?" Nora texted just then, as if she could sense the scene unfolding. "You look like someone who just watched karma arrive in a hard hat." They met at Billy's on Belmont, Maggie's favorite diner since 1986, where the booths were still cracked vinyl and the pie was always served warm. "I have never seen a man less prepared to lose something he never earned," Nora said, stabbing a fry. "He really thought he could out-argue a court order. He thought he could out-embarrass me," Maggie replied, sipping her iced tea, "that if he made enough noise I'd back down. Instead you bulldozed the man." "Literally," Maggie chuckled. "I just gave momentum to what he left neglected." They ordered peach cobbler for dessert, a little too sweet, a little too heavy, and exactly what Maggie needed. For the first time in what felt like years, she didn't feel the need to look over her shoulder or check her phone for fallout. She drove home under a soft gray sky, parked in her own driveway, and stepped inside with her shoulders relaxed and her breath unhurried. That night, she left the windows cracked open. The sounds of the neighborhood, crickets, wind, the occasional car, lulled her into a sleep so deep, not even the distant clatter of demolition the next morning stirred her. She didn't check social media until noon the following day. When she did, she found it, loud, dramatic, and poorly timed, posted in Sophie's signature white text over a soft focus photo of a single high heel on pavement. "Some endings aren't tragic. They're necessary. The engagement is off. #new chapter #solo journey." Maggie set the phone down slowly. Let the quiet settle. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply whispered to herself, one brick at a time. The phone rang just after dawn, the kind of hour reserved for emergencies or heartbreak. Maggie, already up and padding through the kitchen in slippers, stared at the screen. Evan. For a moment, she let it ring. Let the silence remind her that her peace was no longer optional, it was earned. Then she exhaled and picked up. "Hello?" There was a pause. Just breath. Shallow and close to breaking. "She left," Evan finally said. His voice wasn't loud or angry this time. It was thin, unraveling. Maggie leaned against the counter, one hand around her mug, the other resting flat against the cool tile. Sophie? She packed up last night. Said she needed clarity. Left her ring on the coffee table like it was some kind of prop. Maggie said nothing. She said she couldn't deal with the mess, he added, swallowing hard. That she didn't sign up for this kind of instability. Still, Maggie said nothing. I don't know what to do, Evan whispered. It's all just gone. She nodded once, even though he couldn't see her. I'm sorry to hear that. He waited, hoping, maybe for comfort, advice, a lifeline, but none came. Okay, he muttered almost to himself. Yeah, okay. He hung up. Maggie stood there for a while, her tea cooling in her hand, staring out the kitchen window at the garden she and Nora had planted 3 summers ago. The tomato plants were leaning heavy this year, overripe and thriving despite neglect. By 9, Nora showed up without knocking, her version of emotional first aid in hand, a brown paper bag full of warm scones and a box of Irish breakfast tea. Heard it, she said, plopping the bag on the table. Didn't even need to ask. You've got that my son is calling from rock bottom look in your eyes. Maggie arched an eyebrow. Do I? It's the jaw. Gets tight when you want to say, I told you so, but don't. Maggie gave a faint smile and pulled out 2 plates. He called this morning. Sophie's gone. Shocker, Nora said, biting into a scone. The moment the money vanished, so did the curated lifestyle. They sat at the table, sunlight pouring across the wood in long golden bars. It should have felt like a victory lap, but it didn't. Not really. It felt like closure, quiet and unceremonious. What are you going to do with your half of the sale? Nora asked, reaching for the honey. Maggie stirred her tea slowly. Haven't decided. Just then, her phone buzzed again. Frank Delaney, call incoming. She picked up. Morning, Maggie, Frank said. I know we just wrapped a big one, but I've got a thought. I'd like to run it by you. Go ahead. I've been working with a group here in Portland, first-time homebuyers, mostly young families, getting squeezed out of the market by corporate landlords. They need funding for a revolving trust. Nothing flashy, but something that would help people like Evan once was, before all the ego. Maggie was quiet. Her fingers tapped the rim of her teacup. You'd have naming rights, Frank added gently. It'd be your legacy. A slow heat stirred in her chest. Not anger, not pride. Something cleaner, like purpose. I'd like to hear more, she said. I'll put together a proposal, Frank replied. It's yours to shape top to bottom. She hung up and turned to Nora, who raised an eyebrow. Trust fund, Maggie said. Not for Evan. I didn't think so. They laughed, but it was soft, thoughtful. The kind of laugh that came with reinvention, not revenge. Later that night, Maggie was just settling onto the couch with a blanket and a novel, when her phone buzzed again. Evan, I need a place to stay. She stared at the message. No punctuation, no apology, just need. The cursor blinked in the reply field, waiting, and Maggie just sat there, warm in her own home, with the weight of her choice in her hands. The suitcase landed on her porch with a heavy, deflated thud, not the kind packed with optimism or adventure, but with resignation. Evan stood behind it, hair unwashed, eyes shadowed, hoodie zipped up to his chin. He looked smaller somehow. Or maybe it was the way he hovered just beyond the threshold, waiting for something unspoken to undo everything. I didn't have anywhere else to go, he said, voice raw. Maggie stepped outside, closing the screen door gently behind her. She wore a thick cable-knit cardigan, sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal the edge of her silver watch. Her hands were steady. I read your text, she said. I just needed time to think. Evan's eyes searched hers, hoping, did you think about how hard this has been for me? Maggie looked down at the suitcase, scuffed and sunken, then back up at her son, the boy she'd once carried through grocery stores on her hip, the man who had somewhere along the line begun treating her like expired furniture. I did, she said calmly, and I realized this house isn't where your healing starts. He blinked, stunned. So you're really not letting me stay? This isn't about punishment, she replied. It's about boundaries and respect, and not confusing comfort with permission. Evan looked like he'd just been slapped with a poem. I thought maybe, after everything, she didn't finish his sentence for him. That was the old Maggie. After a few seconds of silence, he gave a stiff nod, picked up the suitcase without meeting her eyes, and walked back down the steps. She didn't follow. She watched until he turned the corner at the end of the block, the wheels of the bag dragging unevenly across the cracked sidewalk. Then she went inside and locked the door behind her. Later that morning, Maggie sat across from Frank at the long walnut conference table in his office downtown, pen poised over a series of neatly printed documents. Her name was listed next to the title of something entirely new, the Lowell Trust for First-Time Homebuyers. It was real now, not just an idea, not just a financial move, a living, breathing engine for change. This is structured as a revolving grant, Frank explained. You set the parameters, income range, Portland residents only, application review board, the whole works. And once the first wave of homes is funded, repayments help the next generation. It builds itself. Maggie nodded slowly. I want it to be personal, not bureaucratic. Frank smiled. You're putting humanity back into real estate. That's rare. A knock tapped lightly at the door, and Nora poked her head in. Is it time? Frank waved her in. You're our witness. Nora walked in with a grin and a new lipstick color. I dressed up just enough to make it look like I wasn't invited to a gala. She signed with a flourish, then gave Maggie a subtle wink. Once the final form was notarized and the check deposited, Frank slid the official folder across the table. That's it. You're now the founder of a charitable trust. Maggie placed her hand on the folder, fingers pressing into the grain of the leather cover. For the first time in months, maybe longer, her shoulders relaxed. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It hadn't been for a while. It was about realignment, about carving something whole out of everything that had cracked. She and Nora walked out into the crisp midday air, sunshine dancing off the windshields along 6th Avenue. A jazz trio was playing across the street, and somewhere someone was handing out free coffee samples. Maggie stopped on the corner, blinking up at the light, and breathed deep. The city felt fresh, not different, but renewed. Frank caught up with them just as the light turned green. He walked beside her for a few quiet steps, before glancing over and saying, You just made a lot of people's futures brighter. Maggie didn't say anything right away. She didn't need to, but inside her chest, where the ache had once lived, something warm finally bloomed. The envelope slid into the courthouse file slot with a soft metallic click, unceremonious, almost anticlimactic. But inside it was the final notarized paperwork for the Lowell Trust for First-Time Homebuyers. Maggie didn't linger after filing it. No dramatic flourish, no backward glance. Just the steady click of her heels against the marble floor as she walked out of the building and into the pale autumn sun. The air smelled like damp leaves and the bite of oncoming rain. Clean, sharp. It was done. And Evan would never be listed on a single line. By the time she got home, the email was waiting. Subject line, You've made yourself clear. She sat at the kitchen counter, coat still on, reading the first sentence. I hope you're proud of the damage you've caused. That was as far as she got. Maggie closed the laptop with a soft snap, slid it across the table, and took a slow sip of her tea. She didn't need to read the rest. She'd heard it all before, just never dressed in such formal punctuation. Regret disguised as righteousness, control pretending to be concern. Not today. You really didn't read it? Nora asked the next morning, one eyebrow cocked as she stirred cream into her coffee at Morning Grounds, their favorite cafe off Hawthorne. Didn't need to, Maggie replied, wrapping both hands around her warm cup. They sat tucked into a window booth, the world bustling quietly outside. A teenager walked a golden retriever past a newsstand. A delivery truck unloaded crates of bottled kombucha. A barista laughed behind the counter, steam curling around her like a halo. I thought I'd feel worse, Maggie admitted. And do you? No. I feel. She paused, searching for the word weightless. Nora raised her coffee in a toast. To cutting cords without bleeding. Maggie clinked her cup against Nora's, smiling. To building things that last. That afternoon, Maggie walked into the community bank with a cashier's check in her purse, and a purpose steadier than any she'd carried in years. The branch manager, a woman named Kalisha with a wide smile and soft southern accent, greeted her at the door. "You must be Mrs. Lowell," she said, eyes warm. "Frank told me about your trust. We're honored to host the account." Maggie handed over the envelope without ceremony. "I'd like to make my first contribution." Kalisha opened it, eyebrows lifting slightly at the amount. "This is going to help a lot of people." "That's the plan." They sat in a private office with glass walls, and Maggie watched the way her signature flowed across each form, smooth, unfaltering. She felt no tremble, no second guessing. And then, as if the moment had been waiting just for her, she looked up and saw a young couple sitting on the other side of the glass. The man wore a navy button-down and held a pen like it was a wedding ring. The woman beside him, visibly pregnant, kept blinking fast, trying not to cry. They were signing closing documents. Their first home. Maggie couldn't hear a word, but the moment needed no sound. The couple smiled at each other through their nerves. The woman reached for her partner's hand. The notary leaned in with one more page, and they signed with the weight and wonder of people who had never imagined this day would come. Maggie turned back to Kalisha. "That's why I did it." Kalisha smiled. "You just made sure they're not the last." That evening, Frank called while Maggie was pruning her rosemary bush on the side porch. "I've got something I want to run by you," he said. "Next month there's a gala. Portland Housing Action Fund. The kind of event that usually attracts donors with too much money and not enough context." "Sounds dreadful," Maggie said, trimming a stem. "I want you to speak." She paused, shears in hand. "They need to hear from someone who's walked through the system, seen its cracks, and decided to do something about it," he added. "You'd be speaking on behalf of the trust. It'd raise its profile, could bring in more funders, more families." Maggie leaned against the porch railing, feeling the sting of rosemary oil on her fingers, and the breeze tugged gently at her cardigan. "Me? At a gala? You'd be great," Frank said. "Besides, you've already proven you're not afraid of a room full of people who think they're in charge." Maggie smiled, a slow, curious kind of smile, and for the first time in a long time, she said yes to something with no plan in place. "Send me the details," she replied, "because some voices don't need permission, they just need a microphone." The lights dimmed just enough to cast a soft glow over the ballroom, giving every sequined dress and tailored tux an expensive shimmer. Wine glasses clinked, silverware paused, a hush passed through the tables like a slow tide, and at the edge of the stage Maggie Lowell waited. Her palms were dry, her breath steady, her navy dress a clean, elegant wrap with pearl buttons down the side, fit just right. No frills, no distractions, the opposite of Sophie's feathered, glitter-soaked style, and very much on purpose. Frank stepped up to the podium first. His tie was crooked as always, and his voice had the same steady rasp it carried in court. He spoke briefly about the state of affordable housing in Portland, about the silent desperation behind leases, the urgency behind every down payment, and the quiet victories too few people celebrated. Then he looked toward her. "This next speaker is someone I've known for over 20 years, he said. "She spent her career helping others find their homes. Recently she decided to help a lot more of them, and not just with words but with action. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Lowell." Applause stirred. Modest, respectful. Maggie stepped up to the mic, nodded at Frank and took her place. The lights were warmer here. Not hot, just focused. She could see the outlines of the audience, faces she didn't know but who were watching her now with quiet expectation. She didn't write a speech. She didn't need to. "I was told I had 5 minutes," she began, voice steady. "That's long enough for a story and short enough to keep from rambling, which I'll do my best to honor." Soft chuckles from the front rows. "I spent decades helping people buy houses. Some bought too soon. Some bought too big. Some never thought they'd buy at all. But what I learned is this. A house isn't about square footage or crown molding. It's about dignity. About saying this is mine. I belong here. Several people nodded. Last year I watched my own son try to build a life that looked like success, but was hollow on the inside. I co-signed a mortgage for him, helped him through a divorce, and was later told I was too embarrassing to be invited to his engagement party. Murmurs rose. A few raised eyebrows. I could have shrunk from that, but I didn't. She took a breath. I reminded him and myself that ownership has weight, and that family, just like real estate, comes down to how much you're willing to invest, and whether you're willing to lose what doesn't hold value. The room was silent now. So I sold the house, took my share, and instead of pouring it into anger, I poured it into this trust, so that young families, single parents, and first-time buyers who don't have a financial lifeline can have a fair shot at building something real. She paused, looked across the sea of strangers, because no one should feel like home is out of reach. Not in this city, not in this life. A beat of silence, then applause, then more, then a standing ovation. She blinked, startled, not because she hadn't believed in her words, but because she never expected them to land with such weight. From the side of the room, Nora stood and snapped a photo. Maggie on stage, hand on the podium, eyes shining beneath soft lights, applause cascading like a wave she never asked for, but now welcomed with grace. Backstage, Frank clapped her on the shoulder. You just got yourself a dozen new donors and a whole lot of admiration. I'm not sure what to do with either, Maggie said, half laughing. Just keep showing up. She sat down at her table again, glass of water in hand, pulse steadying. All around her, people buzzed, introductions, thank yous, clinks of glass. But it wasn't until the program ended, and coats were being claimed, that the real moment came. A young couple approached, mid-20s, dressed modestly but with nervous pride. The man wore a second-hand blazer. The woman clutched a folded piece of paper. Mrs. Lowell, the woman asked. Maggie turned, already smiling. Yes, we just wanted to say thank you, the man said. We're one of the first families approved through your trust. We sign next week. The woman unfolded the paper. It was a welcome letter. The address was handwritten at the top. Maggie's throat tightened. She reached out, touched the page lightly, then looked up at them with something electric stirring behind her calm expression. Well, she said, let's talk about that house. The table was mismatched on purpose. Polished oak at the center, fold-out extensions on either side, and chairs borrowed from 3 different neighbors. None of them matching, all of them filled. It was imperfect and warm and humming with laughter that rolled out through Maggie's open windows and into the Portland night like music nobody had to rehearse. She'd lit real candles, laid cloth napkins, filled vases with clipped rosemary and tiny cream dahlias from her garden. And now, as glasses clinked and spoons scraped plates of lemon-roasted chicken and rosemary potatoes, Maggie watched the scene like a quiet director who finally got the performance she always imagined. Her guests were from the gala, people who mattered not because of what they wore, but because of what they built. Kalisha from the bank brought homemade blackberry jam. A housing advocate from North Portland arrived with her partner and a crusty loaf of sourdough. Frank showed up with a bottle of absurdly good wine and a crooked bow tie. Even the young couple Maggie had met at the gala came shy at first, now radiant as they talked about paint colors and their soon-to-be backyard. There was no seating chart, no vibe, no delicate wine pairing, just food and joy. And Maggie chose every single person there. Nora was in rare form, telling a story about how her husband once tried to roast a Thanksgiving turkey without removing the bag of giblets. He thought the plastic bag was seasoning. She howled. We didn't speak for 2 days, but I've never laughed so hard in my life. Laughter erupted around the table. Maggie refilled water glasses and passed around extra bread. Someone turned on soft jazz in the background. The house smelled like garlic and citrus and pie crust cooling on the counter. This, Frank said, raising his glass, is better than any ballroom. To good people, Kalisha added. To real people, Nora amended. They toasted. Maggie raised her own glass, but she didn't speak. She just took in the moment. The weightlessness, the warmth like sunlight on skin after a long winter. The dinner lasted hours. Stories flowed. Strangers became friends. The young couple stayed long after most guests had gone, helping clear dishes and talking about their baby due in spring. The woman Hannah touched her belly gently and asked Maggie if the rosemary in the vase could be replanted. Maggie clipped a fresh bundle for her. When the last guest hugged her goodbye on the porch, Maggie stepped back into the kitchen and exhaled. Dishes were stacked, wine bottles empty. The soft clink of silverware came from the sink, where Nora, still in her glittery earrings, was elbow-deep in suds. You didn't have to do that, Maggie said. Nora grinned, and missed the thrill of conquering 3-day-old casserole dishes. Please. Maggie grabbed a dish towel and joined her. They worked in a rhythm without needing to speak, the comfortable silence of two women who had watched each other survive. When the last dish was placed on the drying rack, Maggie poured herself the last inch of wine and walked barefoot to the porch. The air had cooled. She pulled her cardigan tight and sank into her porch swing. The city lights glittered in the distance, a soft, golden pulse against the night. Crickets chirped. Somewhere a neighbor's wind chime caught a breeze. She took a sip of wine and let the quiet settle. Her mind didn't race. Her chest didn't tighten. There was no grief clawing at her, no bitterness licking at old wounds. Only the clean, firm certainty of a woman who had carved a space for herself and filled it finally with the right people. No Evan, no Sophie, no shame, just joy. Nora stepped onto the porch, drying her hands with a towel. You okay? I am, Maggie said softly. Better than I've been in years. They sat in companionable silence, watching the city stretch and shimmer. Maggie took another sip, eyes soft, voice low. Some invitations are worth sending, she said, and some are worth forgetting.